The neighbor told me it was the feast of Santa Margarita, and I should come to the church if I wanted to, and I said I would think about it. And after he had gone back down the path, I sat on the step and counted the days, and it had been 43. I had been telling myself all along that it had been about 3 weeks. I sat for a while with my hands on my knees and looked across the valley at the line of pines on the opposite ridge, which were so dark in the early evening light that they appeared almost wet. The candle in the kitchen window behind me had not yet been lit. I had been about to light it when Sister Almada had come up the path. The light was that flat blue light you get in late summer when the sun has gone behind the mountain, but the sky is still bright, and the air smelled of wood smoke from someone burning olive prunings down in the village. And the bells of the church were doing their small evening sequence, 3 notes, then a pause, then 3 notes, the way they had every evening since I had been here. 43 days. I went inside, I lit the candle, I put it in the kitchen window. I did this without thinking about it, the way you put on a coat when you go outside, and only when the wick caught and I straightened up and saw my face faintly in the dark glass did I think, I have been doing this for 6 weeks. I want to start, if I can, at the beginning, because I think the beginning is the part that I am still allowed to describe accurately. My Aunt Inez was my mother's older sister. She was 11 years older than my mother, and she had moved to Portugal in 1989, when I was born, and she had never come back. Not for my mother's wedding, not for my grandmother's funeral, not for any of the things that bring people back. My mother had visited her twice. I had met her once when I was 7, and I remembered almost nothing about it except that she had given me a small wooden bird painted blue and that she had smelled of the same soap as my grandmother. My mother had sent her a Christmas card every year. Inez had sent one back. The cards were the depth of the relationship between them. She died in March in the stone house she had lived in for 31 years, alone, of a heart event that doctor in Villarreal described over the phone as sudden but not surprising for her age and history. She was 68. The neighbor, Senor Almada, had found her 3 days after, when the kitchen window had been dark for 3 nights. The Portuguese lawyer in Porto, a Senor Pinto, called my mother in early April. And my mother, who had been ill on and off for almost a year and was finding the whole thing impossible, asked me to handle the estate. She offered to pay my flight, which was a way of saying she was sorry to ask, and I said yes because she was my mother, and because I was due some leave from work, and because, in a way, I am only able to describe now, I had wanted for a long time to see the place where my aunt had decided to disappear. Will, my partner, drove me to Stansted on a Tuesday morning. We had been together for almost 4 years, and he had a way of being quiet about things that mattered, and on the drive he asked me only practical questions. Did I have the lawyer's number? Did I have enough cash? Was my phone going to work? And at the airport he kissed me in the way he did when he was trying not to ask me to come home soon. He said, "Take as long as you need." I said, "A week, maybe 10 days." He said, "However long." I flew to Porto. Senor Pinto met me at arrivals. He was a small, thin man in his 60s in a gray suit, and he drove me out of the city in a beige Peugeot that smelled of pipe tobacco, and the drive took almost 3 hours. The last hour on roads that wound up into hills that became more remote and more beautiful as we climbed. The villages got smaller and the terraces older. The vines clung to slopes that should not have held them. We arrived at the village. I will call it the village. The village's name does not matter for this. At almost 6 in the evening, and Senor Pinto drove the car up a steep, narrow lane to a stone house at the end, and he gave me the keys and a folder of documents in Portuguese with English summaries, and a piece of paper with the names and phone numbers of 3 people, himself, the village priest, and Senor Almada, who lived in the house just down the lane, and who had a key in case of emergency. Senor Pinto told me to take whatever time I needed. He said the estate was modest but uncomplicated. He said most of what I would need to do was sort through Inez's belongings, decide what to keep and what to give away, and notify him when I was ready to list the house. He said he would arrange a local agent. He left me at the gate. I watched the Peugeot reverse down the lane and disappear, and I stood there for a few minutes with the keys in my hand and the bag at my feet, and I looked at the house. It was a small two-story stone house with a slate roof and pale blue shutters that had faded almost to gray. There was a low stone wall along the lane and a wooden gate. Behind the house, I could see a fig tree and the tops of olive trees. The house faced south and west, looking out over the valley, and the kitchen window, I would learn this very quickly, was the south-facing window on the ground floor, with a deep stone sill that you could sit on if you wanted to. The interior was cool and dim and smelled of dust and lavender and the faintly sweet smell that old stone houses have, like the inside of a wine bottle that has been left open too long. There was a kitchen with a wooden table, a small living area with a fireplace, a narrow staircase, and upstairs 2 rooms and a bedroom with a single bed under the window, and a small room my aunt had used as a studio, full of botanical illustrations in various states of completion. The bathroom was at the back of the ground floor, behind the kitchen, added on at some point in a way that suggested the house had existed for a long time without one. I unpacked. I made tea on a small gas ring because I could not figure out the larger stove. I sat at the kitchen table and ate the bread and cheese Senior Pinto's secretary had given me at the office. The light through the kitchen window was the color of weak honey. I could see on the windowsill a small white candle in a clear glass holder, half burned. I remember thinking it was strange that she would have left a half-burned candle on the sill, but I was tired enough that I did not think about it for long. The list was on the kitchen counter. I did not see it until the next morning. It was a sheet of yellow legal pad paper, weighted under a smooth gray river stone the size of a hen's egg. The handwriting was my aunt's. I recognized it from the Christmas cards, the looping, precise script of a woman who had been taught to write before ballpoints. The list had 7 numbered instructions in English, which I will set out here exactly as they were on the paper. 1. Light the candle in the kitchen window at sunset every evening. Replace before midnight if it has burned more than halfway. 2. The window in the bedroom upstairs stays open 3 fingers width every night, no matter the weather. 3. Do not run the tap in the bathroom between 11 at night and dawn. 4. A pinch of salt in a saucer by the front door at sunset. Empty the saucer at first light. 5. Wind the hall clock at noon. 12 full turns of the key, no more. 6. Sweep the front step before you leave the house in the morning. Always before, never after. 7. If a knock comes at the door after dark, count to 7 before opening. If a second knock comes before you have finished counting, do not open. At the bottom, in slightly smaller writing, was a single line in Portuguese that I assumed was a sign-off, the way one might write "all my love" or "take care" at the end of a letter. The phrase was "Não fique mais de 40 dias." Below it, I read the list twice. I looked at the river stone. I looked at the candle on the sill, half burned, just as the first instruction described. I looked at the saucer of salt by the front door, which I had not noticed the night before, but which was there. A tiny mound of coarse salt in a chipped white dish. I will tell you as plainly as I can what I thought. I thought, my aunt was a woman who lived alone for 31 years in a stone house at the end of a lane in a village whose name I did not yet know how to pronounce. And she had developed a set of small domestic rituals that gave shape to her days, and she had written them down for whoever came to the house after her, the way an older woman might leave instructions for the person who would feed her cat or water her plants. The list had a courteous, practical quality. The sign-off in Portuguese was, I thought, an affectionate phrase, the kind of thing a Portuguese-speaking aunt would close with. I decided to follow the list. I did not decide this for any one reason. I had loved my mother's stories about Inez, the little we had, and I felt alone in the house that the list was a way of being respectful, of not crashing into her habits and dismantling them, as though she were not still somehow the resident here. I was 31 and I was grieving an aunt I had barely known, which is a strange, particular kind of grief, the grief for a person who lived a parallel and inaccessible life nearby to your own, and the list felt like a way to be inside that life for a few days before I packed it up. I lit the candle that first evening at sunset. I closed the bedroom window most of the way and left it open 3 fingers, which is about 4 centimeters if you have small hands. I put a pinch of salt in the saucer by the door. I wound the clock the next day at noon. I swept the step before I left for the village in the morning. I did not run the bathroom tap at night, which was easy because I rarely did anyway. There was no knock for the first 6 days. I told myself when I caught myself doing the things that I was just being polite to the house. Senor Almeida came up the path on the second morning with a loaf of bread and a small jar of honey. He was perhaps 75 with thick white hair and the dark, deeply lined face of someone who had spent his life outdoors. He spoke a careful English that he had picked up, he told me, from the British people who had come through the village in the 70s looking for cheap houses. He said cottage with the long English vowel and neighbor with the British er. He said he was sorry about Inez. He said she had been a quiet, good woman. He said that if I needed anything, I should knock on his door, which was the green door at the bottom of the lane. He saw the candle in the kitchen window. It was nearly noon. I had not yet snuffed it. And he nodded at it and said, "Good. She kept it always." I said, "I found her note. I'm trying to keep her habits while I'm here." He looked at me for a moment with his head slightly tilted. Then he said, "That is kind. The house likes its routine." He smiled at his own phrasing as if it were a joke, and I smiled too. He said he would come back another day, and he went down the path. For the first week, the house was beautiful and quiet, and I made progress through Inez's papers and clothes. She had been a botanical illustrator. I had not known this. My mother had described her as something with plants, vaguely. And the studio upstairs was full of her work, careful watercolors of leaves and seeds and roots, labeled in Latin and Portuguese. I sorted them into folders. I called Senor Pinto and asked him about the studio's contents, and he said the lawyer's office could arrange for a local botanist who had been a friend of Inez's to come look at them. I ate at the kitchen table. I drank coffee in the morning, sitting on the front step, looking down at the village, the orange tile roofs descending like a slow rockfall toward the river. I called Will every other evening. I told him the house was lovely and that the work was steady and that I thought I might be home in 10 days. The first small thing happened on the 8th day. I was working in the studio in the afternoon. I had been sorting illustrations for almost 3 hours, and I had lost track of time, and when I looked at my watch, it was 2:15. I had not wound the clock at noon. I went down the stairs. The clock was a round wall clock in the hallway between the kitchen and the front door, an old wind-up clock with a brass key hanging from the case on a string. I had wound it every day. I had not wound it today. I crossed to the clock and reached for the key, and then I stopped because the clock was ticking. The minute hand was at 15 past. The second hand was moving smoothly. The clock was running. I stood for a moment. Then I lifted the key from its hook and turned it. It went 2 turns and stopped. 12 turns at noon. 10 of those 12 had already been used. I put the key back. I went into the kitchen. I made coffee. I sat down at the table. I told myself very calmly that I had wound the clock that morning and forgotten. This was, I knew, the most reasonable explanation. The morning had been busy. I had been thinking about the studio. Of course I had wound the clock and forgotten. I drank my coffee. I want to describe what I noticed sitting there, because I noticed it without quite acknowledging that I had noticed it. The salt dish by the front door, which I had emptied that morning and refilled at sunset the night before, was empty again. I had not refilled it that day. I would refill it that evening, at sunset, as I had been doing. But the salt that had been in the dish overnight should have been there until I took it out at first light. And I had taken it out at first light. And the dish should have been empty all day, the way it had been empty every other day until sunset. The dish was empty, which was correct, but I noticed I was checking it. I noticed that I had developed a habit of checking it. I drank my coffee. I wrote a list of things I needed from the village shop. I went back upstairs and worked on the illustrations until evening. On the 11th day, the first knock came. It was about 9:30 in the evening. The light was almost gone. I was washing a plate in the kitchen. I heard a knock on the front door. 3 taps, not loud. The kind of knock a polite stranger gives at an unfamiliar house when they are not sure if anyone is home. I dried my hands. I started to count. I want to be clear that I had not, until that moment, fully believed I would do this. I had read the seventh instruction along with the other six, and I had told myself I would follow it if a knock came. But I had also told myself, privately, that I was being indulgent, that the seventh instruction was not really a household habit, that it was probably a small piece of rural superstition that my aunt had absorbed from her neighbors and written down without quite meaning it. But when the knock came, I counted. I did not decide to count. I started counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. The second knock did not come. I reached 7, which I counted under my breath with an evenness that surprised me even at the time. I crossed the kitchen and opened the front door. There was no one on the step. The lane was empty in both directions. The salt dish was where I had put it that evening, on the small wooden bench just inside the door. The fig tree at the corner of the house moved a little in a breeze I could not feel from inside. I stood at the door for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I closed it. I went back to the dish and looked at it. The salt was undisturbed. I want to record what I told myself, sitting at the kitchen table afterwards. Because what I told myself is, in retrospect, the part that I should have paid closer attention to. I told myself that someone in the village had come up the lane, knocked on the wrong door, realized their mistake, and walked away while I was counting. I told myself this was the most likely explanation. I told myself that the seventh instruction was therefore harmless, because a person who knocked on the wrong door would knock once and leave, exactly as had just happened. And following the instruction had been merely a small, additional courtesy I had paid the house. I told myself that the instruction had probably been written for the kind of person who might be too quick to open the door at night in a remote village, and that the count to 7 was simply a practical caution. I told myself this, and I more or less believed it. When I went up to bed that night, I checked the bedroom window. It was open 3 fingers. I had checked it before dinner, and it had been open 3 fingers then too. I had not opened it that morning when I had aired the room. I had opened it fully. At some point during the day, between when I had aired it and when I had checked it before dinner, the window had been adjusted to 3 fingers width. I closed it to 2 fingers, briefly. I watched it. It did not move. I opened it back to 3. I went to bed. Senor Almada came up on the morning of the 13th day. He said, brought me some tomatoes from his garden. He sat on the step with me while I drank my coffee. The morning was fine and clear, and the bells of the church were doing their longer Sunday sequence down in the village. He asked me how the work was going. I said it was going well. He asked me if I was sleeping. I said I was sleeping well. He asked me in a casual way whether I had heard anything in the night. I considered this question for longer than I should have. Then I said no. Why? He shrugged. He said, in old houses sometimes, the walls. I said, I haven't heard anything. He nodded. He said, after a pause, Inez was a good neighbor. She kept things in order. He said it the way he had said earlier, that the house liked its routine, and I had the sense again that he was making a small private joke that I was not entirely inside. But the joke was not unkind, and I did not press it. He left. I went into the village to buy bread. When I came back, the front step had been swept. I had swept it that morning before I left. I had not swept it again. The step was clean of the small drift of dust that always built up between sweepings. Clean in a way that suggested it had been swept very recently, within the last hour. I stood on the path and looked at the step for some time. Then I looked down the lane. Senor Almeida's green door was closed. There was no one on the lane. I went inside. I put the bread on the counter. I sat at the kitchen table. I took the list out from under the river stone and read it again. The list was the same. 7 numbered instructions in English in my aunt's careful handwriting, with the Portuguese sign-off at the bottom and the initial I. I read the sign-off. Não fique mais de 40 dias. I had 40 days of school Spanish in my head, and that was all the Romance language I had, and the phrase looked vaguely like, do not be more than 40 days. A closing phrase, a wish or a benediction. I thought, I won't be. I'll be home in another week. I want to describe the second knock because it is the one I think about most. It came on the 18th night. I had eaten late. I had been tired. The candle in the kitchen window was new. I had replaced it at 11 before going up. I had brushed my teeth at the bathroom sink at 11:05, and I had remembered just before turning the tap that I was inside the no-tap window. I had wet a cloth from a bottle of water instead, and I had used it to clean my teeth and my face, and I had felt foolish doing it, but I had done it. I was at the top of the stairs when the knock came. It was 3 taps, like the first one, but slightly louder. I froze. I started to count. 1, 2, 3. The second knock came at 3. I did not move. I was halfway up the stairs with my hand on the wooden rail, and I stayed like that, not moving, while my count continued silently internally. 4, 5, 6, 7. I reached 7. I waited. There was no third knock. There was no sound at all from below. I went very slowly the rest of the way up the stairs and into the bedroom. I did not turn on the light. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The window was open 3 fingers. I could see through the gap the faint outline of the fig tree against the night, and beyond it the dark mass of the opposite ridge. I did not hear footsteps on the path. I did not hear anything from the lane. Eventually I lay down. Eventually I slept. In the morning the salt dish was empty. I had not emptied it. I always emptied it at first light, as the instructions said, and first light had not yet come when I went downstairs. The eastern sky was just beginning to show gray behind the ridge, and the kitchen was still dark. The dish was empty. The salt that had been in it the previous evening was gone. The dish was clean. Not just empty, but clean, as though it had been wiped. I refilled it from the small box of salt in the cupboard. I went back upstairs. I lay in bed until the sun came up. Then I got up and made coffee. I want to record what I did next, because this is the day I started to lose track of how I was responding to things. I went down to the village. I bought bread, eggs, a bottle of wine, and a small bag of olives at the shop on the corner of the square. The woman at the shop, who was perhaps 60 and who had been pleasant but reserved with me on previous visits, smiled at me when I came in and said, "Bom dia, Doña Inês." I said in my poor Portuguese, "Helen. My name is Helen." She blinked. She said, Sim, desculpe." She rang up my groceries. As I left, she said, "Bom dia, Helen." But she said the Helen the way you say a stage name, with a small, audible quotation around it. Walking back up the lane, I passed Shorta Mendonca, who lived in the house with the yellow shutters next to the chapel. She raised a hand at me and said, "Bom dia, Doña Inês." I said, "Bom dia." I did not correct her. I walked on. I want to describe what I felt, walking up the lane with the bread and the eggs and the wine, because what I felt was complicated. I felt a small, pleasant slip of being seen. I felt, against all the things I knew about myself, that being mistaken for my aunt was a kind of grace that the village was extending to me, that they were folding me into the shape she had left, because the shape was familiar, and because grief in a village is a thing that has to find a place to settle. I felt that correcting Senora Mendonca would have been ungenerous. I also felt, and I am writing this because it is the part I remember most clearly, that I had not corrected the shopkeeper firmly. I had said Helen once and let her say it once. The correction had been performative. I had not insisted. That night I lit the candle. I set out the salt. I closed the bedroom window to 3 fingers. I wound the clock at noon. At noon on the dot, because I had become precise about it. I did not run the bathroom tap. I swept the step in the morning before I left. I called Will. He asked me how the work was going. I said there was more than I had thought. I said maybe another week. He said, "Helen, are you all right?" I said I was. He said, "You sound a bit far away." I said, "I am a bit far away." He laughed. He said, "Come home soon." I told him I would. I meant it when I said it. The drawer with the older lists I found in the second week. I had been going through the bureau in the studio, sorting Inez's correspondence, and in the bottom drawer, beneath a folder of seed catalogs, I found a manila envelope. Inside the envelope were 3 sheets of yellow legal pad paper. The first was in Inez's handwriting, dated 2018. The same 7 instructions, the same sign-off. The second was in Inez's handwriting, dated 2003. The same 7 instructions, the same sign-off. The third was older still. The paper was yellowed at the edges and the ink had faded to a sepia brown. The handwriting was not Inez's. It was a careful, looping Portuguese hand. The 7 instructions were in Portuguese, but they were recognizably the same 7, in the same order. At the bottom was a Portuguese sentence I could read because by this point I had been translating signs for 2 weeks. Não fique mais de 40 dias. The signature was an initial, M. The paper was dated 1971, 18 years before Inez had moved into the house. I sat on the floor of the studio with the 3 sheets of paper laid out on the boards in front of me. I sat for a long time. The room was warm because it was midday and the sun was through the studio window, and I could smell the dry smell of paper and the faint medicinal smell of the pigments my aunt had used in her watercolors. I thought, this is a household tradition. The previous owner of the house left these instructions to my aunt, who left them to me. The list is something handed down with the keys. This was a comforting thought, and I held on to it. The third sheet, the one in the unfamiliar Portuguese hand, had a small note in the margin, in pencil, in Inez's handwriting. The note said in English, left these for me. The 40th day matters. Don't be careless. I read this several times. I did not understand what the 40th day matters meant. I read it as a warning about hospitality or about the village's tolerance for visitors. 40 days as a Lenten kind of thing. A traditional length. I read it that way because I needed to read it that way. I put the 3 sheets back in the manila envelope and put the envelope back in the drawer. I did not move the original list from under the riverstone. That night, the candle in the kitchen window burned longer than it should have. I had lit it at sunset, around 9:15 at that time of year. I had checked it at 11, and it had been burned about a quarter of the way down. At midnight, before I went up to bed, I had checked it again, and it had been burned about a third of the way down. The instructions said to replace it before midnight if it had burned more than halfway, and it had not, so I had left it. I was halfway up the stairs when I thought to look back through the kitchen doorway at the candle, and I saw that it was burning at the same height it had been an hour before. I came back down. I went to the window. The candle was burning steadily, its flames strong and small. The wax level was a third of the way down the candle. The candle was a household candle, the kind that burns at a known rate. I had been using them for 2 weeks. I knew how fast they burned. I stood and watched the candle for several minutes. The flame did not shorten, the wax did not pull further. The candle, while I watched, did not burn. I went up to bed. In the morning, the candle was burned almost to the base. I replaced it with a fresh one in the cupboard and lit it again. No, I did not light it. I would light it at sunset. I put the new candle in the holder on the sill. I want to be clear about what I noticed and did not notice. I noticed the candle. I noticed the village calling me by my aunt's name. I noticed the salt dish being empty before I emptied it. I noticed the swept step and the wound clock in the bedroom window adjusted to 3 fingers when I had left it wider. I did not notice until much later that I had stopped writing the date on my morning notes. I had been keeping rough notes in a notebook each day. What I had sorted, what I had found, what I needed to do. And at some point in the second week, I had stopped putting the date at the top. The notes had become continuous, undated. I do not know when I stopped dating them. I noticed it eventually because I went to look up something I had written and could not tell which day I had written it on, and when I flipped back, I saw that the date stopped on the 11th of August. After that, only the contents. I started dating them again. By then, it was the 28th. The flight booking I made on the 29th. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and Senior Pinto's office Wi-Fi password, which the secretary had given me, and I booked a flight from Porto to Stansted for the 3rd of September. I emailed Senior Pinto to tell him I would be leaving, and that I had finished the sorting, and that I would be ready for the local agent to come and inventory the house when I returned to the United Kingdom. I emailed Will. He emailed back within an hour. He said he would pick me up at the airport. He said he had missed me. He said the flat felt empty. I packed my suitcase that evening. I packed almost everything. I left out only the clothes for the next few days, a toothbrush, a book. I lit the candle. I put out the salt. I closed the bedroom window to 3 fingers. I went to bed. On the morning of the 31st, I went down to the village to take the bus to Villarreal, which was the first leg of the journey to Porto. The bus did not come. I waited at the stop for an hour with 2 old women who waited with me, and the women said something to each other that I could not follow. And eventually one of them turned to me and said, in slow Portuguese, greve, strike, no bus today. I walked back up the lane. I emailed Senior Pino. He emailed back almost immediately. He said the strike was a regional one and would last 3 days. He said he was sorry. He said the next available bus would be on the 3rd of September, which was the day of my flight. I rebooked the flight for the 5th, the 32nd day, the 33rd, the 34th. I lit the candle. I put out the salt. I closed the bedroom window to 3 fingers. I wound the clock. I did not run the tap. I swept the step. There was no knock. The 35th day was the Feast of São João, which I was told by Senor Almada when he came up with a small bottle of his own wine. And I went down to the village in the evening because the village was alive with strung lights and small fires and music from a portable speaker outside the cafe. People nodded at me. Boa noite, Dona Inês. Boa noite, Dona Inês. I said boa noite back. I did not correct anyone. A small girl, perhaps 6, came up to me and gave me a sprig of basil. It was traditional, Senor Almada had told me, on São João to give basil. And she said, para si, Dona Inês, and I said, obrigada, and I took the basil and I went home. The basil sat on the kitchen table for 2 days before I noticed I had not put it in water. On the 38th day, I called a taxi from Villarreal to take me to the airport. The taxi came. The driver was a friendly young man who spoke a little English and who told me about his cousin who lived in Manchester. We drove down out of the hills. The countryside opened out. About 20 minutes from the airport, the taxi began to make a sound. The driver pulled over. He looked under the hood. He came back to the window and said, in apologetic English, "Madam, I am very sorry. The car will not go further." He called another taxi. The other taxi took 35 minutes to arrive. By the time we got to the airport, I had missed the check-in window. The flight had closed. I rebooked at the desk for the next available flight, which was on the 40th day. I want to describe sitting in the airport that afternoon while I rebooked, because I felt, for the first time, the small, clear bell of something that was not quite right. It was not panic. It was a flat understanding that I had now missed 2 flights in a row. The first had been a strike, which was a known kind of disruption, and the second had been a breakdown, which was also a known kind of disruption, and either of these on its own would have been merely bad luck. The 2 together in a row, with the same destination, were, I could not say what they were. They were a pattern that had not yet arranged itself into a shape I could name. I took the new ticket and went outside and got in another taxi and rode back up to the village. The driver did not charge me for the return. He said in Portuguese that I followed only roughly, that the village had an account with the taxi company for the house. I did not understand this at the time. I thought he meant the lawyer's office had an account. I was very tired. I let it go. The village was lit when we arrived. The fires of São João were 3 days behind, but the strung lights were still up. Senor Almada was on the path when the taxi let me out at the bottom of the lane. He took my bag from the taxi and said, "Helen, you did not go." I said, "The taxi broke down. I have a new flight in 2 days." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. He said, "I will carry your bag up." He carried it up the lane into the front step, and he set it down. He said, "Tomorrow is a quiet day. The next day is Santa Margarita. It is a good feast. Maybe you will come to the church." I said, "Maybe." He said, "Boa noite, Dona Helen." He had never called me Dona before. He had always been careful to use the casual form. Dona Helen was correct, but it was not what he had been calling me. He went down the path. I picked up my bag and went inside. I lit the candle. I put out the salt. I closed the bedroom window to 3 fingers. I went to bed. The next day was the 39th. The morning was very still. I sat on the step with my coffee and watched the valley fill with the kind of mist that comes off the river in late summer and rises slowly through the terraces. And I thought about my aunt for the first time in some days. I thought about the wooden bird she had given me when I was 7. I thought about the careful watercolors upstairs. I thought about her dying alone in this kitchen, in the chair I now sat in to drink coffee. I thought about the candles she had been lighting every evening for 31 years, and the salt she'd been putting out every evening, and the 7 knocks she'd been counting in the dark. I thought about the older list in the drawer, the one in the unknown Portuguese hand, and the woman M who had handed the list to my aunt when she had taken the house in 1989. I thought about M's note, in pencil, in my aunt's hand. The 40th day matters. Don't be careless. I went inside and took the manila envelope from the drawer. I sat at the kitchen table. I looked at the 3 lists. Then I went to the kitchen counter and lifted the Riverstone and looked at the original list. My aunt's, dated 3 days before her death. And I read it slowly, instruction by instruction. I had been doing all 7, faithfully, every day. I read the Portuguese sign-off, "Não fique mais de 40 dias." I took out my phone. I opened the translation app. I typed the phrase in, slowly, letter by letter. The translation was, "Do not stay more than 40 days." I read it. I read it again. I read the words in Portuguese back to myself, the way I had been reading them for almost 6 weeks, as though they were a benediction. I sat at the kitchen table. I put the phone down. I looked at the list. 40 days. The instruction was 40 days. I had been here 39. I want to describe the sensation because the sensation is the thing I cannot quite get right. It was not fear. It was the feeling you get when you come home and find that someone else has rearranged your kitchen. The small disorientation of a familiar space behaving as though it has its own intentions. The list in front of me was not a benediction. It was an instruction. It was the most important instruction. It was numbered nowhere. It was at the bottom in a language I had not bothered to translate because I had assumed it was decorative. I had read past it for 39 days. I had a flight the next morning. I called the taxi company. They said they could send a car at 5 in the morning. I confirmed. I went upstairs and packed the rest of my things. I left out only what I needed for the night. I lit the candle. I put out the salt. I closed the bedroom window to 3 fingers. I wound the clock at noon. It was already past noon when I came down with the suitcase, but I wound it anyway. I did not run the tap. I swept the step in the evening, although the instructions said to sweep before leaving in the morning, because I would be leaving before sunrise and I wanted to be sure. I went to bed at 10. I did not sleep. At 3 in the morning, the knock came. It was 3 taps. I started counting. 1, 2. The second knock came at 2. I did not move. I did not get up. I lay in the bed in the dark with the window open, 3 fingers, and I listened. I heard, very faintly, footsteps on the path, walking away from the door. I heard them go down the lane. I heard them stop somewhere near the bottom, and then I did not hear them again. I lay awake until the alarm went at 4:30. The taxi was not on the lane at 5. I waited until 5:15. I called the company. The dispatcher said the driver had had a problem and could not come, and there was no other car available until later in the morning. I said I had a flight at 9. The dispatcher said she was very sorry. I said, could she try anyone else? She said she would. I sat on the step with my suitcase. The sky was gray-pink behind the ridge. The bells of the church were not ringing yet. Senor Almada came up the lane at 6. He came up slowly. He had a small bag of bread in his hand. He stopped at the gate and looked at me and at the suitcase. He said, "Your taxi has not come." I said, "No, the driver is sick." He nodded. He said, "I am sorry, Doña Helen." He said this with what I want to call a particular gentleness, the kind that recognizes a situation it has seen before. He said, "Today is a long day. Tomorrow is Santa Margarita. The roads will be busy. Maybe you will not get a taxi until after the feast." I said, "I'll get a taxi today." He said, maybe, maybe. He held out the bread. He said, for now, eat. Come down to the village later. The feast will be tomorrow, but the preparations are today. You should see them. He left the bread. He went down the path. I called the taxi company 3 more times that morning. The dispatcher was apologetic and helpful and unable to send a car. I called Senior Pinto's office. The secretary said Senior Pinto was in court all day and would call me in the afternoon. I called Will. He did not pick up because in London it was the middle of the night. I went into the kitchen at noon and wound the clock because I had been doing it every day at noon for 39 days, and my hands knew the way without my asking them. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the list under the river stone. I lifted the stone and looked at the 7 instructions and the sign-off, and at the small added note I had not seen before, which was at the very top of the page, in handwriting that was the same as my aunt's, but a little smaller and a little neater, in pencil, between the title line where she had written Helen and the first numbered instruction. The note said, if you stay past 40, light the candle for me also. I do not know whether the note had been there all along. I want to be honest about that. I do not know. I had read the list every few days for almost 6 weeks. I had memorized the 7 instructions. I had not memorized everything else on the page. The note was small. It was in pencil. It was tucked between the title and the first instruction in a way that I could plausibly have read past it many times. I cannot say with certainty that it was new. I can say that I had not seen it before. I sat with the list for a long time. The light through the kitchen window changed. The valley filled with the heat of the afternoon. The bells did their 3 in 3 sequence. At some point, I went outside and sat on the step. The neighbor told me it was the feast of Santa Margarita, and I should come to the church if I wanted to. And I said I would think about it. And after he had gone back down the path, I sat on the step and counted the days, and it had been 43. That is where this began. I had been telling myself it had been about 3 weeks. I lit the candle. I am writing this in the kitchen, at the table, by the candle in the window. The candle is new. I lit it at sunset. The wax is barely lower than when I lit it, although I have been writing now for almost 2 hours. I want to record a few things, and then I think I will stop. Senior Almada came up again at 8 to tell me that the taxi company had called the village telephone. I have no idea how, since the village does not have a single phone, to say that they could send a car tomorrow at noon, but only if I still wanted one. He asked me gently whether I still wanted one. I said I did. He said he would tell them. He went back down the lane. The flight tomorrow has already gone. There is no flight booked for me anywhere now. I would have to book a new one. To book a new one, I would need to use the laptop, which is upstairs, in a bag I packed 2 nights ago with the rest of my things. I am not upstairs. I am in the kitchen. I have not been upstairs since this morning. The suitcase is in the hall by the front door, where I left it when I came back inside from the step. I have been thinking about the older list. The one from 1971, in the unknown Portuguese hand, signed EAM, and about the note in my aunt's English on the margin of that older list. The 40th day matters. Don't be careless. I have been thinking about Inez taking the keys from Memoirs in 1989, and about M handing them to her, and about the list that came with the keys, and about the 40-day instruction at the bottom of that list. M would have been the previous tenant. M would have, perhaps, lived here for some long stretch of years before Inez, and would have, at the end, handed the house to a new keeper who could continue the 7 things that needed to be continued. I have been thinking about the woman at the shop who said Doña Inez and corrected herself. I have been thinking about Senora Mendonca, who did not. I have been thinking about Senor Almada calling me Doña Helen on the lane 2 nights ago, the way you might call a child by their full name to make a point. I have been thinking about the candle that did not burn while I watched it. I want to write the next thing carefully because it is the thing I am surest of. The candle in the window is burning now. I can see it on the sill from where I sit. I can also see faintly my reflection in the dark glass behind the candle. The reflection is mine. I want to be clear about that. The face in the glass is my face. The shape of my own jaw, the line of my own hair, the small, dark shape of the freckle on my left cheekbone that I have had since I was 12. But the reflection is not quite the age I am. It is older by a few years, not many. 3, perhaps 4. The skin around the eyes is set differently. The mouth is held the way I have always thought my mother held her mouth when she was concentrating, although I had never noticed I held mine that way too. I look at the reflection and I think, I have been sitting at this table for a long time. I am tired. The candle is making the glass strange. I look at the reflection and I think, this is what I will look like in 3 or 4 years. I look at the reflection and I think, this is what Inez looked like in the picture on the lawyer's desk when she was about my age in 1992 or 1993, when she had been here for 3 or 4 years. The taxi is coming tomorrow at noon. I have asked them to come. They will come. I will get in the taxi. I will go to the airport. I will book a flight. I will go home. Will is not answering his phone tonight. It is late in London. He is asleep. I will call him in the morning. I want to record one more thing. When I lifted the Riverstone tonight to look at the list, the note at the top had moved. It was no longer in the small space between the title line and the first instruction. It was at the very bottom of the page, beneath the Portuguese sign-off, beneath the I. It said the same thing. If you stay past 40, light the candle for me also. The note has been moving. It is moving to where I will look next. The candle is burning. The salt is in the dish. The window upstairs is open, 3 fingers. The clock has been wound. The step is swept. The tap is off. There has been no second knock tonight, although I was counting internally all evening, and I will count again if a knock comes, because I have been counting now for 6 weeks, and my hands know the 7 things by themselves, and I do not have to ask them. I will go to bed soon. I will lie in the bed under the window with the 3 fingers of cold air coming through. I will get up tomorrow before the taxi. I will sweep the step before I leave. I want to think about leaving, and I find that when I think instead about the candle and about whether there are enough candles in the cupboard to last the rest of the week. I counted them this evening. There are 9. That is enough for 9 evenings. Tomorrow I will buy more from the shop in the village, in case the taxi does not come, in case the flight does not happen, in case the road is closed for the feast, in case any of the small things happen that have been happening. I will buy the candles in the morning. The shopkeeper will say, Bom dia, Doña Inez, and I will not correct her, because by now correcting her would be unkind, and because by now I am not sure what I would correct her to. The candle is at the same height it was when I lit it. I have stopped writing the date at the top of these notes again. I do not know when I stop this time. I will start again tomorrow. There is a small sound at the door now. It is too soft to be a knock. It is the sound of someone resting their hand against the wood. On the outside, where the salt dish sits on the bench just inside. I am counting.